welcome to the last Director Seminar of this term. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Bill Janeway, but before I do, I'd just like to say that as usual we will be live streaming this event, but not the Q&A, so don't worry, you will not be starring on anything. The Soundbites and seminars will begin again next term on January the 10th with food sovereignty and the Land Workers Alliance. But before we get to that, we have this wonderful event this evening. Now, Dr. Janeway is not a stranger to UCL. He's spoken here on many occasions. He's an economist, he's a venture capitalist, he's a thinker about contemporary times. He's been writing about such things as how to recognize new economic thinking, something I'd like to know how to be able to do, the retreat from globalization and what it's meant to us, why productivity is on decline in many contexts. But what he's going to talk to us about tonight is the digital revolution and the state, and what he calls the Great Reversal. Now, Dr. Janeway's written a book, a very good book, called Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy. There are examples here. You can use this flyer and buy one, so buy one, everybody.
20% off.
20% off. 20% off, exactly, 20% off. Dr. Janeway started his career as a Marshall Scholar at the University of Cambridge in economics. He now is part of Warburg Pincus, where he's responsible for the information technology investment side of things. And he's going, I think, to explain to us why the digital revolution and the state have diverged from each other and exactly how that's happened. So, Bill, please.
Thank you very much, Henrietta. I'll do a brief, can you hear me?
Yeah.
We don't need this technology stuff. Actually, after I got my doctorate at Cambridge, determined not to pollute young minds with the neoclassical production function, I went on a 35-year sabbatical and discovered I was a venture capitalist along the way. Retired as vice chairman at Warburg Pincus in 2006, in time to return to Cambridge for the global financial crisis to make economics a really interesting subject again. So I am now back immersed in the Faculty of Economics at Cambridge, while continuing to serve as a resource for Warburg Pincus and a committed member of the board of the Institute for New Economic Thinking and the Social Science Research Council. And all of my work, both as an academic and as a working venture capitalist, has been involved with innovation at the technological frontier, where progress is made by trial and error and error and error, where efficiency in the allocation of resources is the enemy of innovation, and where, indeed, the neoclassical production function is a radically misleading lens through which to understand what's going on. So, for some 250 years, production possibilities, consumption possibilities have somewhat haphazardly moved forward as a function of three processes: upstream, scientific discovery, technical invention, for the technologies that really matter, the deployment of transformational networks from the railways through electricity grids to the internet, and then the downstream quasi-Darwinian exploration of the new economic space in order to discover what to do with it that will be of commercial significance. All three of these processes depend on sources of funding that are not focused on immediate, visible economic value. Historically, there have been two such sources: the mission-driven state motivated by national development, national security, and financial speculation. I call this interaction the three-player game between the state, financial speculators, and the market economy, which has been successively transformed by the mobilization of resources to deploy new technologies, which have in turn actually created new economies. Now, the metaphorical relationship to the three-body problem in physics is not an accident. Here as well, there are an infinite number of possible configurations of the game. None of them represent a stable equilibrium. In one version, the version whose consequences we are living with today, state investment in fundamental research induces financial speculation to fund construction of transformational infrastructure whose exploitation in turn raises living standards for everyone dependent on the productivity of the market economy. But there's another one. Only 10 years ago, we experienced a world in which bubbles and crashes in the financial system spill over and liquidate both the employed and their employers, generating appeals to the political process for redress and relief. And in the third version, which certainly in the United States feels a little too close to comfort, malefactors of great wealth, Teddy Roosevelt's great turn of phrase, are able to exploit the political process in order to preserve and protect their exploitation of the market economy. Let's start with the role of the state. It has a long history. Sorry, we jumped one. We jumped two. Gotta be careful when you don't have a clicker. So this is actually recent work. It's recent work on how the British Army's demand for muskets from the Glorious Revolution through Waterloo, rising from a few thousand a year to a few million a year, transformed the architecture of England's artisanal economy and made Birmingham the workshop of the first industrial revolution. This is the role of the state as the customer for technology. But it's also a source. A generation later, it was the armories of the United States Army that perfected the new novel capability of making things out of interchangeable parts. Precision engineering. Simon Winchester has a new book. He has a new book every year. This is about the precision engineers who enable, as I say, beginning in Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, and Springfield, Massachusetts, beginning using interchangeable parts to make guns, those same technologies, that same precision engineering, transferred to making sewing machines, typewriters, bicycles, automobiles. This was the technology that enabled the mass production revolution of the 19th century. Now, most recently, it was the United States Department of Defense, again, that was responsible for sponsoring, both as a funder of research and as the first customer, for all the technologies from silicon to software and onto the internet that combined to create the digital revolution. Now, I want to pause for a moment to reflect on the language of war. Economically, what it means is that when successfully invoked, it liberates the state from the shackles of prospective cost-benefit analysis. In other words, it articulates a message that being effective is more important than being efficient. That language has been transferred effectively by, of all people, President Richard Nixon, to the war on cancer, which in turn empowered the National Institutes of Health with a decimal order of magnitude increase in funding to be the sponsor of the genetic revolution, where again, the NIH was not to be evaluated based on whether each one of its grants actually succeeded. Effective is more important than efficient. But, at least in the United States, and I think it's fair to say over here as well, from Vietnam through the Second Iraq War, by way of the, quote, war on drugs, unquote, the language of war has been debased. It would be an act of extraordinary political entrepreneurship today in the U.S., and we may come to this at the end of this talk, to work out how to, again, mobilize that concept for good, for positive and productive purposes. Now, let me switch to the role of speculation. The first law of bubbles is that they are ubiquitous. They are banal. Wherever there are markets and assets, you will find herding behavior, momentum investing, prices decoupling from any relationship to cash flow, past, present, or prospective. But not all bubbles are the same. This is a simple two-dimensional graphic to call out the relationship between the locus of speculation and the focus of speculation. It took me about 5 years to come up with that meme. Very proud of it. Locus and focus. Makes it easy to remember. If the speculation is limited to the public capital markets, the stock market, the junk bond market, where leverage is limited, leverage is very, very limited, then when the bubble inevitably bursts, the damage, the economic damage done, is also limited. When the speculation infects the credit system, the banks, where leverage is orders of magnitude larger, 30, 40, 50 times capital going into the global financial crisis, the economic consequences can be, and again were, devastating, catastrophic. The difference between 2008 versus 2000 when the tech bubble burst. But the focus also matters. Most bubbles, the speculation focuses on assets with no possibility of increasing the production possibilities of the economy, from tulip bulbs to marijuana stocks. We can talk about where Bitcoin fits in to that spectrum. But occasionally, as with the railroads, electricity in the 1920s, the roaring 20s were not all just about drinking martinis and jumping into the fountain in front of the Plaza Hotel. It financed the enormous expansion of electricity generating and distribution in the United States. And then, of course, the great tech bubble of the 1990s. Now, history here too. This is work of one of the most remarkable scholars I've ever come across. Andrew Olisko of the University of Minnesota is a pure mathematician, well published in the literature of pure mathematics. You know those articles where the only words you understand are the and. He also, some 25 years ago, became interested in and then obsessed with the early history of British railways. And this is his work graphically demonstrated. On the left, we have the millions of pounds per year invested first in the little railway mania of the 1830s, and then in the great railway mania of the 1840s. On the right-hand side is an index of the share prices, which are Lithgow constructed, of the companies that were raising and spending the money. At the end of the 1840s, when the index collapsed, many of them went bankrupt, but nobody tore up the rails. Similarly, in 2000, 2001, when companies named things like Global Crossing and WorldCom went bankrupt, nobody pulled the dark fiber out of the ground. It was available for Google, Amazon, Netflix to take advantage of. This is speculation funding transformational infrastructure, but that's not the only thing that tech bubbles have done. This is empirical work of looking at the young companies, less than 15 years old, in the 7 highest tech sectors of the American industry. It charts the aggregate cash flow from internal operations and external fundraising for those companies, where this 8 times increase in less than 10 years is a function of an enormous explosion of shares offered on the stock exchange, IPOs and follow-on financings. R&D follows. Now, the money raised here represents a stock, R&D is a flow, so of course it tails off slowly afterwards. But this mobilization of funding is what funded the experimentation that created the build-out of the digital revolution. Now, from World War II through the 70s, we had what you might call the most constructive configuration of the three-player game with venture capitalists and entrepreneurs. As I realized myself in about 1985, that we were dancing on a platform that had been constructed by the United States Department of Defense. And our peers, venture capitalists and entrepreneurs in the world of biotechnology, were dancing on a platform that was in process still of being constructed by the National Institutes of Health. All of that activity was enormously accelerated and amplified by the great tech bubble of the late 1990s, such that it matured into a full-fledged digital revolution. Now it's time to address the consequences, the economic, social, political consequences of that revolution. And when I sat down to really re-examine the material that I've been working on, the motivation is actually closer to home, even while this new version of my book is substantially revised and extended for the age of Trump and Brexit. The original motivation was actually quite close to home, closer to home than referenda and presidential elections. As a working venture capitalist, I'd internalized what I call the two fundamental theorems of venture capital. Cash and control. Cash and growth. How can you hedge against the inescapable ignorance of investing in startups at the technological frontier? Well, the answer I learned is you can, by having unequivocal access when bad things happen, and they do, believe me, unequivocal access to enough cash to buy the time to find out what's going on, and enough control to change the parameters of the problem. By selling the project, by repurposing the technological development, usually begins, in my experience, by firing the CEO. Corporate happiness is positive cash flow. This was the mantra of someone I learned an enormous amount from, an extraordinary analytical brain applied to these problems. When your customers are giving you enough money, enough more money than it costs to deliver the good or product that you're selling, it means two things. One, what you're doing is economically worthwhile, but it also means that you've been liberated from dependence on the problematic availability of external capital. Well, when I looked around 2-3 years ago, both of these theorems were fundamentally contradicted by this phenomenon, the unicorn bubble. These new companies, burning billions of dollars, funded at premium valuation by institutional investors, public market institutional investors, companies for whom the notion of positive cash flow was a needless constraint on limitless growth to world domination. The institutional investors mobilized and motivated by what has come to be called FOMO, fear of missing out, not only to provide cash at extraordinary valuations for shares that they cannot sell, for illiquid securities, but also to yield governance, to yield control to the brilliant founders of these new companies. With a detailed analysis of this loss or transfer of control, recent article in the University of Pennsylvania Law Review. By the way, anybody who wants these slides, these should be public domain. And by the way, at the end of this, there are 3.5 slides of bibliography. I like reading lists. So the consequences were not hard to imagine. I think you probably all know about what happened at Uber a year ago or so when Benchmark Securities, absolutely first-class venture firm, had to go to federal court to get the founder, Travis Kavalnik, removed from the company before he destroyed the business he founded. By the way, Uber remained $1 billion a quarter away from positive cash flow from operations. So we'll see what the valuation comes to be when there's a freely traded market in its shares. Theranos is this alleged, it hasn't been yet proven in court, but demonstrable fraud perpetrated by a young, brilliant undergraduate who, just dropping out of college without graduating doesn't make you Bill Gates. This was actually not funded. Theranos wasn't funded by leading venture capital firms. It was funded by such extraordinarily powerful financial forces as Rupert Murdoch. $900 million burned in the course of about 4 years. In any case, in addition to the unicorns, of course, there was another phenomenon that was challenging what I had learned in the trenches of venture capital. Cryptomania. As I said, we can talk about Bitcoin and blockchain and their significance and how to think about them. I have myself quite strong views. But here, the point here is twofold. So this was proposed as an alternative, complete financial system, an alternative to the system, the money that has been developed, managed, sponsored by the state. As Mark Blythe, an extraordinary professor of political science, political economy at Brown University, and one of the few who actually did work as a stand-up comic during his transition from Dundee to Providence, Rhode Island. Mark likes to say, if you have to ask if it's money, it's not money. But along with the unicorns, along with the Ubers and Airbnbs at the micro level of local cities, the cryptocurrencies at the most macro of levels, I realized these represented only two examples of how the digital revolution had matured to the point where it was challenging the authority of the state that it spawned it. So, three principal channels through which the digital revolution has been operating. The first, as you got a quick glimpse, globalization, IT-enabled globalization. Now, the first great globalization that peaked in 1914, not coincidentally immediately with the start of the First World War, the first globalization was also technologically enabled. It was enabled by steamships, telegraph, telephone, railways. In that case, the movement of capital and people was internationally free. The movement of goods was constrained by the fact that the two most important follower nations chasing Britain to the leadership role, Germany and the United States, were very strongly protectionist as their industries were maturing to being more than competitive with England's industries. So the gross, and this is what this measures, you can't see from there, but what this measures is that at the peak in 1914, gross trade, imports plus exports, as a share, as a percentage of global income, peaked at about 30%. This time around, with a peak perhaps at 2007, gross trade in the context of goods, services, and capital being free to move, and while people certainly have not been free to move, work has been, outsourcing, transnational complex supply chains, all enabled by IT. In this case, gross trade has peaked at about 60% of global income. Now, the first political consequence of this has been what Danny Roderick of the Harvard Kennedy School calls the political trilemma. You can have deep economic and financial integration between nations. You can have representative, responsive government. And you can have national autonomy. 2 out of 3. States in the U.S., North Dakota, deep economic and financial integration with the rest of the country, and then through the country, the rest of the world. Representative local government, responsive to local needs. No national autonomy. Greece thought it had national autonomy until 2011, 2012, and discovered that its integration with the rest of Europe meant that it did not. And of course, political spillovers. This is work by extraordinarily productive group at MIT led by David Autor, one of many papers published over the last relevant papers over the last decade. This did a very clever thing. It looked at the 435 congressional election districts in the United States, measuring in each case the exposure to Chinese imports after China joined the World Trade Organization. What they observed was that in the more Republican districts, the candidates nominated by the party moved to the right. And conversely, in the Democratic districts, they moved to the left. The consequence of globalization in local politics was polarization. Now, arguably, in fact, demonstrably, automation, this new wave, one of several historically, of automation empowered by digitalization, has had a much bigger impact on labor markets than globalization has. Reading, finding observable evidence of the direct political consequences, not easy because it's mixed up with so many other things that are going on. Here's one exercise from Oxford, limited, suggestive. What they did there was create not congressional districts, but homogeneous, reasonably homogeneous geographic districts in the United States, and then counted, in effect, the population of robots. Now, obviously, robots, actual industrial robots, represents one, not minor, but certainly not dominant expression of the digital revolution. I mean, outsourcing software development to India is another. There are many, many, many more. But in this case, what they did was count the robots in each of these areas, and then count or observe the shift in the Republican share of the vote for president between 2012 and 2016. Obviously, the regression line is up and to the right. There's certainly not enough data here to make draw causal conclusions. This is what we would call suggestive evidence, but it is indicative. The third channel for the impact of the digital revolution has been financialization. I think we're all generally aware it's been going on. Even I, who've been living in this, was not quite how dramatic this gear shift came as computers became broadly available through the financial sector. Okay, this goes all the way back to the early 1950s. It's the ratio of the value of financial assets to US GDP, a proxy for the cash flows underlying and more or less validating the prices of these financial assets. From the early 50s to 1980, that ratio grows only from 1.3 to 1.8 times. If you did that on an annual rate of growth, you'd hardly see it year by year. But from 1980 to 2007, it goes from 1.8 to 4.8 times. There is a fundamental regime change. What drives that regime change? It's the fact that computing operationalized modern finance theory. It turned the Black-Scholes equation from an abstract mathematical object into a working tool, first on the floor of the exchanges like the Chicago Board of Trade, then into engines for manufacturing new securities, derivative securities, the supply of which is limitless. This is what Donald Mackenzie, great scholar at the University of Edinburgh, was writing about when he wrote his book, and this is why I so respect Donald Mackenzie. He published his book, An Engine, Not a Camera, meaning that finance theory was an engine for transforming financial markets, not a camera for representing how they work. He published that in 2006, 2 years before the global financial crisis. Easy to publish it afterwards, really hard to have published it before. Now, digitalization didn't just explode markets and financial assets country by country. It also globalized finance to an extent never before seen. This is an iconic, you can find this now in many papers, an iconic graphic from the Bank for International Settlements in Basel. Five major regions of the world, with the links representing the interbank claims, the short-term capital claims between these two regions. From only 2002 to 2007, 5 years, US banks' claims on Europe went from $500 billion to $1.5 trillion. European banks' claims on the US went from $1 trillion to $2.6 trillion. This was how an embarrassment in the American mortgage market could produce a global financial crisis. So the digital revolution indeed played a central role in the crash and the Great Recession that followed. I put Adam Tooze's book up here because I do believe it's likely to prove the most significant historical analysis of the sources and consequences of the global financial crisis. Tooze is a historian at Columbia University. This is an extraordinary book. The political spillovers from this continue to unfold. This is work done a year or two ago, which looked at financial crises of the 20th century into the 21st. The chart here is the full sample, pre-World War II, post-World War II. Despite the signal example of the United States in 1933, the political response to global financial crises, to national financial crises, whether they go global or not, has been a discernible, measurable, rightward move in domestic politics. And for the US, this is what indeed I call the great reversal. Because the American state has proved itself to be incapable of effectively buffering its constituents from the consequences of the digital revolution for which it itself was responsible. So how did we get here? How did we get here from what the French call the glorious 30 years to this state of stasis, paralysis, and radical frustration and disappointment? Well, ideas really matter. 1943, Friedrich Hayek, understandably, responding to the totalitarianisms of the left and right, Stalin as well as Hitler, Hitler as well as Stalin, wrote a book in which he argued that any economic role for the state would inevitably lead to tyranny. This book went viral in the United States, a cut-down version published by Reader's Digest magazine, sold literally millions. And over the course of a generation, it was developed into a political doctrine that was most visibly represented by Milton Friedman. This is his television series, watched by millions in the United States in 1980, which in turn was the kind of opening act for President Reagan's first inaugural, in which he said, government is not the solution, government is the problem. Now, these ideas were aligned with the vested interests of very powerful economic power centers and the foundations that they funded in the market economy. The three-player game is shifting. And they were also rationalized by a generation of economic theory, not all of which came from the University of Chicago. The efficient markets hypothesis, the rational expectations hypothesis, whatever the rigor with which those models were developed and presented, whatever the nuances introduced in their academic form, the political message was very simple. Left to themselves, markets will deliver efficient, stable, fair outcomes. And consequently, the only economic role for the state is to screw them up. Now, fortunately for the United States and the world, there is institutional latency. It's a historical phenomenon. Despite the intellectual and political triumph of these ideas, the structure of our economies had not responded as had been desired. Now, this is a chart that you can't see from up there, so I'm going to explain it in some detail. It begins in 1880. It runs till the present day. It measures the share of national income represented by public expenditures. Public expenditures. So back here it's very low. The two world wars stand out. Those are the two spikes. Between the wars, the UK is gold. This is for UK, Germany, Japan, and the US. UK is gold. It stays up here in part substantially because Britain was the debtor combatant in World War I that did not repudiate its debts, either directly or indirectly. This is very largely debt service. The US is here. In 1929, total public sector in the US represents 7% of the national economy. 5% is state and local government, with the states required by their own constitutions to balance their budgets, with the result of, as tax revenues declined as the US entered the Great Depression, spending had to come down as well. The federal government was all of 2% of national income, utterly incapable of buffering the private sector's, offsetting the private sector's collapse in spending. Now, in fact, in the 4 years before Franklin Roosevelt became president, the federal government's share of national income actually doubled. The reason is that nominal GDP, measured in current prices, in 4 years declined by 50%. 50%. Okay, this time around, even the US grossed up for transfer payments, pensions, health care, 35 to 40%. In fact, it was not only aggressive central banks that put a floor under the economic consequences of the global financial crisis. It was the fact that public sector expenditures, not only in Europe, not only in Japan, but also in the US, continued to flow even when the private sector froze in the winter of 2008, 2009. Now, the US today represents an extraordinary economic paradox. Indeed, it's the home of the leading digital giant firms, what David Autor again calls the superstar firms, whose profitability, whose high compensation can actually be read. They're so significant in the national data. They are, their market power is fueled by a new source of organic market power, and that is data. This has not yet been absorbed into economics, but additional to, different from, economies of scale, economies of scope, and network effects. Data as a source of market power follows from the digitalization of services. More data, better algorithms. Better algorithms, higher quality service. Higher quality service, larger market share. Larger market share, more data. In only 10 years, Google and Facebook together now are the recipients of something like 70 to 75% of all online advertising revenue, which itself is continuing to grow at double-digit rates. This is extraordinary market power. But it is accompanied by a set of measures of the loss of economic dynamism in the U.S. economy at large. This is recent data from the U.S. Census Bureau. Employment by small firms has declined monotonically over the last now almost 40 years, while employment by big firms, in red, firms with more than 5,000 employees, has risen from about 30% to a third of the economy. That's one measure, but there are many others. The number of public companies in the U.S. since 2000 has declined by 50%. That's partly private equity, but it's more merger and acquisition activity with the antitrust laws effectively suspended. That's another Chicago story we can go into if you like. It does mean, as Author's work showed, that market share of the top firms in each industry sector across the economy, manufacturing and services both, has measurably increased, along with profit margins and arguably economic rents. Social and economic mobility, I could show you chart after chart. Raz Chetty's work, readily available, he's now back at Harvard, shows, for example, that if you look at people age 30, every year from World War II to the present, people age 30, their income against what their parents were making when they were 30. Well, at the end of World War II, that percentage that are doing better than their parents at the age of 30 was 90%. It's now 50%, it's half. Half are doing less well than their parents did. Obviously, the cultural, social, political shock of that is extreme. Financial short-termism, which is now discernible in the enormous institutionalization of the stock market, the rise of index funds, feeding through to the incentives for corporate management, which is heavily oriented towards the price of their shares. So indeed, their interests are aligned with their stockholders, but their stockholders' interests are short-term, and so are theirs. One example is the application of corporate cash flow by public companies to buying their shares back. It's the single largest use of the cash flow that these companies generate, much larger than investment in assets, physical or virtual, or R&D. In the U.S., as you probably are aware, the unionization of the labor market, of people in the labor market, has gone through a very dramatic transformation. And some recent work at Princeton has been able to track this back to when unionization became a significant factor in the 1930s during Roosevelt's New Deal. This is remarkable kind of economic archaeology. And what they show is an almost perfect inverse correlation between what they call union density, the share of union membership by geography, with income inequality. As union membership increases, inequality declines. Inequality reaches the lowest level in the late 50s, 1960s, when unionization is at a maximum. As unionization in the private sector has become almost invisible, now it's well under 10%, inequality has risen instead. So the red line is the share of income in the U.S. for the bottom half of the distribution, the 50% below the midpoint. The 1% are in blue, from 12% to more than 20%, even as the share of the bottom half has gone from more than 20% to 12%. What's actually interesting here is that the share of the 1% has stayed up at the 20% level since the global financial crisis over the last 10 years. Now, in this context, those interested, like me, in the state of the innovation economy have another factor to contend with, and that is the effective exclusion of science from the process of considering public policy. In the White House, beginning a generation ago, there's an office called Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP. On January 19th, 2017, if you went to that website, this is what you would have seen. Last day of the Obama administration. Behind every one of these tabs up here, resource library, R&D budgets, OSTP blog, countless number of programs, projects, reports, conferences, people, activity. This is what it looks like today. Behind this, you can't click through, there's nothing. Under this, well, when I put this up until December 4th, over the course of 19 months, 20 months, there were 8 press releases. There are now 10 press releases. That's the total output of OSTP since Trump was elected president. Well, he was not elected, but took office. So, in the US, having failed to respond effectively to the great digital disruption, government has also advocated from the next needed green, clean, technological revolution. And it follows, and I think we're beginning to see cumulative evidence almost day by day, loss of political authority at home and abroad. Markets, both financial and real markets, depend on political underwriting. This was so dramatically clear just 10 years ago with the global financial crisis. Believe me, whatever happens with Brexit, it will be clear in Britain that the quality of political underwriting is essential to continuity of economic and financial life. So let's revisit the three-player game in a long perspective. From the late 18th century, for some 220, 30 years, as market capitalism expanded, as powered by industrialization, productivity, income, wealth was distributed, and much of it did, particularly when unions laid claims on it. When it empowered politically merchants and artisans becoming a new industrial workforce, peasants entering the political sphere. Representative democracy emerged haphazardly, country by country, first in the US in the 1820s, as the political counterweight to the extraordinary increase in market power. But the coexistence of market capitalism and representative democracy, which we've come to take for granted, in fact, is recent and fragile. It broke down in some of the most important countries in the world in the 1930s, came closer than most would like to know in breaking down in the United States. And today it's obviously once again under extreme stress. Now, the significance of China's rise is not only the extraordinary increase in participation in the world economy, in the drive to reach the technological frontier, which has clearly been achieved in a number, not all, but in a number of fields. And whatever happens to the slogan Made in China 2025, it is clear that that drive to the frontier will continue. Now, China will face enormous challenges, as every nation that has tried to reach the frontier has faced, and why, in fact, only the US succeeded in overtaking its predecessor. First of all, inevitably, the entrepreneurial state generates enormous opportunities for corruption, for reciprocal rent-seeking between those in the market and those in the political process. Most follower nations, have succumbed to that corruption. Occasionally, Britain in the 1850s and 60s, belatedly, the US in the 1880s to 1910s, were able to deal with, to limit the corruption tax to a level which did not cripple and compromise the continued maturation of their political economies. China is clearly determined to do that now and is clearly making genuine progress. But it's also the case that the institutions that get you to the frontier, often named national champions, become obstacles at the frontier. In Korea, the chaebols; in Japan, the zaibatsus, which were the engines for catching up with the United States, failed quite miserably, particularly in the world of IT and the digital world, to be genuine innovators. So even in the US, probably no enterprise in America was more important during the 20th century as the US became the unequivocal leader of the innovation economy than AT&T, the telephone monopoly with the Bell Labs, the enormously productive Bell Labs. AT&T fought the technology that is the basis for the internet at every possible level, from the technical working groups to the White House. Part of it may have been intellectually honest. They really didn't believe that packet-based switching would work reliably. But part of it was undoubtedly because if it did work, it would undermine the circuit switch-based monopoly that AT&T enjoyed. China has made great progress in shifting resources from the state-owned enterprises to the private sector. But actually, I think that the most significant challenge from China is in the political sphere. China is proposing an alternative to representative democracy, what you might call, perhaps somewhat generously, the benign surveillance state, as the means of dealing with the social, political, and economic consequences of the innovation economy at the frontier. The notion being that through the social credit system, through the multiple hundreds of millions, billions of cameras deployed, it will be possible to identify where things are breaking down locally, where there is protest against what may well be the inappropriate, excessive use of political power for personal advantage, creating the potential to go in and fix the problem without having to have a structure of representatives with political voice to articulate the needs and demands of their constituents. Of course, the same technology can be used to punish the protesters, and it is well more than 2,000 years since Juvenal said, "Oh, there's an extra slide here that is missing." So I will tell you what it is. Anybody here in the audience, have any of you read classics? Did you have to do Latin in school? Yes, up there. Quis custodes ipsos custodia. Who shall guard the guardians themselves? That's what Juvenal said. And that, of course, is the question that China will be addressing to itself. But in the meantime, the Chinese are aware of this. These are two excerpts from Xi Jinping's major speech at the last People's Congress, the last party Congress. In this, which comes first, he talks about the contradiction between the unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs and their demands for democracy, rule of law, fairness and justice, security, and a better environment. A few pages later, he spoke about the absolute requirement for everyone in the party to do more to uphold party leadership and the Chinese socialist system. We must do more to safeguard China's sovereignty, security, and development issues, and staunchly oppose all attempts to split China or undermine its ethnic unity and social harmony and stability. The existential conflict is clearly one of which Xi Jinping is well aware. Okay, let me conclude. From an American perspective, and you gather I speak from there, even though I spend a good deal of the year 50 miles north from here in Cambridge, England, this is a dark picture. The fellow who hired me at Warburg Pincus some 30 years ago used to say, you can't survive as a venture capitalist if you're a pessimist. First time you lose a startup, you'll slit your throat, you'll be out of the game. So I am temperamentally doomed to be an optimist, and there are sources of optimism. There's an immediate one. There were indeed numerous green shoots in the midterm American political election. It wasn't just the 40 new Democratic members of Congress. At the state and local level, there were lots of really encouraging good news, especially in those states that Trump narrowly won, which gave him the Electoral College victory. But beyond that, ideas still matter. And in this respect, the global financial crisis and the Great Recession are gifts that continue to keep on giving to the academic disciplines of economics and finance. They forced a reunion of those disciplines, which had, over a generation, grown apart. Finance in the business schools, economics, practicing models that by construction excluded the possibility that anything that happened in the financial sphere could have any impact on employment, investment, spending, the real economy. It's forced recognition of the behavioral foundations and undermined to the point of liquidating the fantasy of the robotic, rational, omniscient, intertemporally optimizing agent as a subject for driving economics. And it's forced a return, now very visible in the literature, to empirical analysis, evidence first, theory second. And speaking as an old Keynesian from old Cambridge, I have to say it's thrilling to see books. Oh, I did have it, it was just out of order. Books emerging from the twin citadels of New Cambridge, MIT and Harvard. Andrew Lowe at MIT is one of the great financial economists of his generation. Andrew Schleifer at Harvard, probably, I think Larry Summers would call him his #1 student. Very different scale of study of these books, but each of them represents a direct, explicit, head-on assault on the rational expectations hypothesis, which delegitimized government as an economic agent. This is enormously encouraging, providing, if you like, top cover for younger academics, not as distinguished, to be a little more adventuresome in pursuing the new economic thinking that I myself am radically devoted to. So let me close with the necessary last sentences of Keynes's general theory. The power of vested interests is vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas, not indeed immediately, but after a certain interval, soon or late, it is ideas that are dangerous for good or evil. When these new ideas that have been emerging, it may take a generation, it took from Hayek to Friedman a generation for those ideas to become culturally dominant. It may take a generation, but when these ideas inform the space where public policy is discussed, debated, and decided, they will be powerful for good. Thank you very much.
Is it working?
Yeah.
Yes, good. We've actually worked out how to make it work.
Is this one working? No.
No.
Is it working now? Is it? Or I'll just bellow.
Well, you've got your other one on, so you've still got your.
Okay.
So where we do? Well, let's just start with the
Well, that took care of it.
That's okay. It'll never work again. That's fine. Don't worry. They'll charge you for it later.
Don't
worry about it at all. So new economic thinking. I mean, one of the questions is why does it take so long for new economic thinking to come through?
Because, Henrietta, you know this as well as I do. My mother said to me 60 years ago, contemplating the riots in the South against Brown versus Board, against the desegregation of American schools. She said, you know, by and large, people don't change, but they do die.
Well, yes. So if we're looking at this picture of declining productivity and declining real wages, I mean, for the UK, this started sometime in the 1970s, right? And suddenly there's a productivity crisis everybody's talking about. And of course, technology is meant to improve productivity, essentially. So how do you think this is going to play out through the long term?
Well, first I think it's, you know, as usual, it's really important, as Piketty told us about national income, to look beyond the aggregates, to look beyond the mean, to look at the distribution. So while there's a lot of argumentation going on, some of the best work on this is taking place at the Office of National Statistics and Diane Coyle's program there, to understand how challenging it is to capture the statistical effects of digitalization. Of, you know, all that work that you used to pay people for that you now do yourself. And by the way, don't get compensated for the data you're generating, which, as you do that work, is being turned into cash and profit by Google, Facebook, etc. The whole additional subject. But the OECD and then the Bank of England have done these very detailed analyses, market by market, sector by sector. The OECD paper sort of coined the term, which is now beginning to go viral, the best versus the rest. The top 5 to 10% of firms, sector by sector, actually their productivity has not slowed down. It continues to grow. But the gap between the best and the rest has widened enormously. Now, I think there are multiple sources of this. One is evidently, it does take time, not just to develop and deploy broadly new technologies, it takes time to transform the processes through which those technologies transform work, transform work programs. Paul David, the great historian of technology, wrote a paper in 1990. Now it's almost 30 years ago. That can't be right, is it? Yes.
Unfortunately, it is.
It is. Paul David wrote a paper called The Dynamo and the Computer. It was a response to the great MIT economist Bob Solow, who had notoriously said at that time, just before the takeoff of the great tech bubble, we can see computers everywhere but in the productivity statistics. Now in 1990, the fact was, you could see a computer on the desk of every tenured professor at MIT, but you couldn't see them everywhere. But what Paul David pointed out was that in 1900, you could have said, we see dynamos everywhere, but in the productivity statistics. It took another 25 to 30 years for electricity to become, in effect, transparent. That instead of having to buy your own motor, buy your own generator, hire your own brilliant electrical engineer from MIT or Imperial or Cambridge, you had to, 25 years later, 30 years later, except in Britain, which was a little slow on this, you just plugged it into the wall, whether what it was a household appliance or whether it was a machine tool. And you could reconfigure manufacturing processes without tearing down factories. So it really takes time for these technologies to deploy. My own expectation is that we're going to see an increase in measured productivity as the measurement process shifts to take account of digitalization and as the rest get access to these new technologies through the cloud. But the best are going to continue to be better because of this power of data. Having said that, the distributional issue remains. And constructing relevant labor market collective bargaining for the gig economy is possible. We've got some green shoots, Uber driver guilds mobilizing city by city to work on to bargain on the terms and conditions of driving cars, plus a social safety net, which in the U.S. still remains appallingly hole-ridden and dependent on employment, when employment is no longer anything like the way it was in the 1950s or 60s. So these issues are going to remain. And the issue of, as I say, not the aggregates, but the distribution of income and access to meaningful work, I think is going to be the political issue of the next generation. I agree on that completely.
Yes, I think the issue of meaningful work is very important. But just thinking again about the failure of the state then to buffer to citizens for these kinds of changes. So we've just seen in the markets, a slight weakening of the share price of Google, Apple, etc., and this seemed to be, for those of us who were sort of lying in bed in the early morning rather hoping it would be, right, the result of a certain kind of public debate gaining momentum, that there was something about this monopoly that wasn't appropriate, right? So is that really what it is, or is it just a blip as far as this goes?
First, 25% decline in share price is more than a little correction.
Yeah.
This was really substantial.
Yeah.
Second, the tech backlash, the backlash against big tech is very real.
Yeah.
It's going to be even more real as the new Congress comes back in.
Yeah.
It's called in, I'll give you an example of this with respect to Facebook. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg is having a forced March education in social science, history. This all begins with the fact, and it is a fact, that the young digital geniuses, because they knew they were inventing the future, didn't think it was worth wasting any time learning how the present works, let alone how it came into being, until it bites them. And now it's biting them hard, biting them in individual cities. You know, Airbnb just lost a war in New York City against the hotel industry. And of course they tried, this is outrageous. This is outrageous that an industry that had evolved over 200 years, that had developed a working ecology of regulation around the provision of accommodation, that they should push back when we came in to destroy their businesses. How outrageous is that? So they're getting a little education of realism. Facebook is the most extreme subject of assault, more so than Google. Google's problems are almost more internal. You know about the walkout of Google employees. That was global. With Facebook, it's really on the front pages. It's interesting. There's going to be a very interesting process to observe. Now, this is in the public domain, although it hasn't been played out. Last April, as the tech resistance was building, Facebook agreed, and I say this is public, to a program whereby it's going to make, from April 2018 forward, the news feed available to peer-reviewed scholarly examination, orchestrated and supervised by the Social Science Research Council, with the two academic leaders coming from Harvard and Stanford, entirely funded by independent foundations that deliberately cover a broad political spectrum or ideological spectrum, from very progressive left to the Koch Foundation on the right. With Facebook agreeing by contract that it will have no control over the questions that are asked or the research that is published. If they renege on that, which I think most people involved in this think it maybe as much as 50% likely they will, but if they renege on this is going to be very public that they've done so, and it will be fed to the congressional committees that will be engaged. Now, more broadly, the notion that we have to redefine, reconstruct competition policy for the digital age, which Brussels is onto. And dare I say it, that the Anglo-American countries got a lot to learn from Brussels and Brussels' response to the digital revolution. Well, in the US, this has just begun to surface. There was a young woman published an article that again is kind of going viral in the Yale Law Review, which was perhaps the leading intellectual journal for the academic law, on exactly this, antitrust for the age of Amazon. So it's early days, but remember, from when Rockefeller got control of the refining industry in the US to become the world's first billionaire, it was 30 years from then to the breakup of Standard Oil.
Yeah. Okay. So just finally, then, before we open it up to the floor, because everyone is getting very excited and they're preparing their questions, at least that's the principle.
I can see them.
Yeah,
see those
they're looking excited,
please.
they're brains are whizzing around. So something that we have been working on in the Institute for Global Prosperity is a new approach to the welfare state of the 21st century.
Yes.
So that's something we've been talking about a lot and work that's going in interesting directions. And here, this is about, how can the state and how should the state buffer citizens
Right.
for processes of structural transformation in the economy that either we didn't foresee or we haven't thought about or are happening, just out of the blue, depending on your position. So here, of course, in the UK, as in other parts of the world, there's been a great deal of talk about the fact that we can't afford the welfare state, and then, of course, how are we going to afford universal basic income? Now, these, of course, are not the same thing, as you understand, but the decline in, the cost of providing collective public goods has become an issue in the kind of economies we live in, partly because of where we choose to place value.
Right.
That's another issue. But also the question of how do you see this question about UBI? I mean, if we look at what the cost of it's going to be immense in a country like the United States. Should they ever do so?
I along with a number of very thoughtful people whom I respect and talk to a lot, and they include this really brilliant young Frenchman now resident in London, Nicolas Coulin, whose book Hedge is, I really recommend. It is literally, the subtitle is A Greater Safety Net for the Digital Age. Very thoughtful, but so Tim O'Reilly, who's outside director, I've been there for 15 years at O'Reilly Media, also quite skeptical and critical about the UBI approach as a sort of exercise sponsored out of San Francisco Bay Area, Silicon Valley, of almost a slogan instead of a program.
Yeah.
It's partly because of the sheer cost. It's also because of not really focusing in on what really are the issues. So issues that include, well, first of all, the U.S., let's just say universal health insurance, let alone universal access to Medicare single payer system, getting to a single payer system in the U.S. We spend twice as much as the average of all the other OECD countries on healthcare with outcomes that are no better and whose actual distribution of outcome is much worse than any other country in the OECD. It's just appalling. So promoting UBI versus addressing that. Second, addressing access to education, in particular, the one program that I think has very broad appeal across the political spectrum is basically making the community colleges free, while funding them to provide more, if you pardon the expression, German-style training for access to the kind of jobs that are going to continue to exist, however machine learning technologies evolve, because they do involve the integration of routine tasks which machines are good at, with the tasks that machines are terrible at, which is interacting with other human beings. So I think that a lot of people, and I'm very sympathetic to this, see UBI really as a distraction from coming to grips with the more direct and obvious needs and increasingly intense needs of people that are now subject to digitalization on top of loss of union membership, loss of community.
And increasing inequality.